Good evening. My name is Pete Peterson. I am the Executive Director of the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement, which is based at Pepperdine School of Public Policy, and it is a great honor and pleasure once again to be working with the Trinity Forum in sponsoring another one of our evening conversations. I have to say that in coming to this stage around this book this evening, I come here rather sheepishly. I do bring you greetings from Malibu, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but it is very cold here. Very cold. I think I left half of my year back on 15th Street. But these are first world problems, aren't they? But I do come here from Malibu, and really, as it pertains to the subject of this evening's book, the real only threat of violence in Malibu is walking by Justin Bieber's house. And so, I'm glad you laughed, because that's really the end of the jokes. You know, the last time we were gathered here together was about 4 months ago, and we were, again, quite honored to be sponsoring an evening conversation with Andy Crouch and his book, Playing God. And it wasn't until I was about a quarter of the way into Gary's book, The Locust Effect, that I understood how many similarities and crossovers there were in the themes of those two books, and especially the understanding of the importance of institutions. There's a part in Andy's book towards the end in which he labels the declining power of governing institutions, family, civil society, as something he calls zombie institutions. He defines zombie institutions as organizations or institutions that are only caring about themselves. They really have no interest in protecting or serving others. And it struck me as I was reading Gary's book that really undergirding the entire book was this discussion around the declining power of institutions, starting most locally with a family, moving towards and through civil society, and obviously through government. And in that's really the reason when I was speaking with some folks at Pepperdine that we were so excited to be sponsoring this evening, because if there's anything that really separates the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine from just about any other policy school in the country, is it's our intentional focus on understanding that while government needs to be reformed, real change in culture can only happen when we understand the rightly ordered power of all institutions, starting with a family, moving towards and through civil society, starting with local government, and then moving up through into national and federal government. So we are very excited to be here this evening and to be sponsoring this event. Gary, the last time I saw you speak was actually at Pepperdine. It was 2 years ago at the law school, and so it was one of the best graduation speeches I have ever heard. So not to put anything on you for this evening, but when Cherie had told me that we were able to put this evening together around this very important book, we're just very excited to be a part of this. So I want to call up my partner in intellectual crime, Cherie Harder, from the Trinity Forum to introduce this evening's speaker. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction, Pete. And I just wanted to add my own welcome to all of you tonight for Pepperdine and Trinity Forum's evening conversation with Gary Haugen and Mark Lagon on the Locust Effect, why the end of poverty requires the end of violence. As Pete noted, this is the third in a four-part lecture series that we are privileged to partner with and host with Pepperdine University on the moral sense in politics and policy. And it's really delightful to be able to offer a civil, reasoned, sometimes even humorous forum to discuss the often combustible mix of morality, religion, and politics. And we're also delighted that each of you is here. It's a full house tonight. We think you're going to find this discussion to be a really compelling and fascinating one. And while there'll be time for audience questions, there's never quite enough time. So I wanted to let you know that we are live blogging this event. You can follow along not only on our Facebook page, but on our Twitter account and participate in the conversation, either using hashtag Trinity Forum or hashtag the Locust Effect. We'll also be recording this evening so you can share that with others later. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Trinity Forum, we provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. We believe that ideas do have consequences, and that part of the Christian mandate of loving God with all of your mind requires thoughtful contemplation of the great ideas and questions of our time. And so it is our mission and our joy at the Forum to provide both publications and programs such as this one today to help leaders engage life's biggest questions and ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. And certainly, one of the great questions pertains as to how to order a society and enact and enforce laws and encourage customs to secure justice, safety, and opportunity for its citizens. But for the majority of people in the world, justice, safety, and opportunity are not something that can be taken for granted. And while extraordinary innovation and resources have been invested in development and opportunity creation for the global poor, there is ample reason to believe that such investments will fail without dealing with the dark and often unseen reality that shapes much of their lives: the daily threat of predatory violence. The exciting potential of newly built schools, wealth, and healthcare centers cannot be realized if the poor are afraid to walk there. Efforts to educate girls will fail if girls can't get to school without being attacked. New vaccination centers won't be visited if it's unsafe to make the trip. Without addressing the primal need for safety, resources dedicated to poverty alleviation may instead be siphoned off and eaten up by bullies, cronies, and corrupt officials in what our speaker tonight has termed the Locust Effect. How can this be? The simple, if horrifying, answer is that often there is nothing to protect the poor from oppression, abuse, and violence, whether the law itself favors the rich and powerful or its protections are limited to those who can pay for them. For far too long, in far too many places, the poor have lived as virtual outlaws in fear and vulnerability, where even their most focused, creative, and successful efforts to start a business, seek an education, provide for their family, or even protect their own health can be undone in a second by predatory violence. And as our speaker today will argue, the rule of law and a just legal system are so vital to economic development and social progress that the end of poverty requires the end of violence. It's a challenge to much of contemporary thinking about poverty alleviation and global development, as well as a call to arms in addressing oppression and injustice around the world. And it's hard to think of a more visionary or more experienced activist and author to make that call than our speaker tonight, Gary Haugen. Gary serves as the president and the CEO of the International Justice Mission, a human rights agency that secures justice for victims of slavery, sexual exploitation, and other forms of violent oppression through working with local governments to rescue victims, enforce laws, prosecute perpetrators, and strengthen local justice systems. Before he founded IJM in 1997, he served as a senior trial attorney with a police policy misconduct task force at the U.S. Department of Justice. In 1994, he was detailed by the Department of Justice to lead the UN genocide investigation in Rwanda, where he directed an international team of lawyers, investigators, and forensic experts in gathering evidence against the perpetrators of that genocide. And he previously worked for the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights and served on the Executive Committee for the National Initiative for Reconciliation in South Africa. Gary also serves on the Human Rights Leadership Coalition and on the Board of Overseers for the Berkeley Journal of International Law. In addition to authoring numerous articles on foreign affairs, he's also written several books, including The Good News About Injustice, Terrify No More, and Just Courage, in addition to, of course, the book we'll be hearing about the most tonight, authored with his co-author, who is with him, Victor Boutros, who we're delighted to have here, entitled The Locust Effect: Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence, published by Oxford University Press. Responding to Gary will be Ambassador, Dr., and Professor Mark Haugen. Mark is the Global Politics and Security Chair at the Foreign Service Program at Georgetown University, where he teaches on ethics and decision-making and the UN and global institutions. He is also an adjunct senior fellow for human rights on the Council for Foreign Relations. He previously served as the CEO of the Polaris Project, a leading anti-human trafficking nonprofit, which actually operates the U.S. government's national anti-trafficking hotline. He previously served with the rank of ambassador as the director of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons at the U.S. Department of State, where he chaired and coordinated the efforts of all U.S. agencies to combat human trafficking both domestically and internationally. And in his spare time, Dr. Haugen serves on the board of directors for the Council on Community Democracies, a founding board member of the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking, and an advisory board member for the Stanley Foundation, the UN Watch, and the U.S. chapter of ECPAT for End Child Prostitution and Trafficking. At the end of Gary's remarks, Mark will offer a response, and then we'll have a time for audience Q&A. Gary, welcome.
Well, thanks, Sherry, very much for the kind introduction. It's truly a privilege to get to be part of the Trinity Forum's tradition here of just very thoughtful discussion about things that matter and to discuss them as full human beings, including the dimension of our life of faith. So thank you for that opportunity. Pete, thank you for the sponsorship of Pepperdine. I remember well that occasion, getting to speak at graduation, because it was the most relaxing speaking engagement of my life, not just because we were overlooking the Pacific Ocean, but I had the chance in preparing that to sit with the interns in the lunchroom, and I asked, because I was trying to get some ideas for their graduation talk, and so I thought, well, why don't you tell me, what your speaker at graduation said? Not a single one of them could remember anything. You can't remember what your graduation speaker said either, right? So then I realized, they're not going to remember anything that I say. I can say whatever I like. So this is a different audience perhaps as to their rigor and care. But thank you again, Pete, for sponsoring such a night. I'm also very thankful that Victor Boutros is here. And Victor, will you just please stand so that people can see who you are? And thank you very much. Please introduce yourself to Victor afterwards and engage him with some of your questions as well. I'm also just very grateful to many, many friends here in the audience who are actually part of writing the book. My name gets to be on the book. Victor's name is on the book. But if you go to the acknowledgments, you'll just find scores of people who are part of this project. And many of them are here. And I'm just really, really, truly grateful. And I'm grateful that you are here. It's a Monday night, Tuesday night. And you could be in a lot of other places. And tonight we're here to talk about global poverty. And that you would care about such a thing matters. Because this is what is most important to those who are suffering, hurting, and dying because of poverty, is whether or not anyone cares. But before we begin with sort of their stories far away, I'd like to start with a story more close to home. It's a story of a woman in Oregon. She's living in a rural county, and she's home alone in her house on a weekend night. And it's dark. She lives in a rural area, so she's really very much by herself, and she's alone in the home. And she begins to hear somebody trying to break in through the window. And she looks, and she sees this man actually trying to break through the window of her home, which is terrifying enough to anybody. But it's especially terrifying for her because 2 weeks before, he had assaulted her and put her in the hospital. And so now here he is again, breaking in viciously into her home to attack her. So she does what anyone would do. She picks up the phone and calls 911. What proceeds over the next 10 minutes is one of the most painful conversations you can imagine, where this poor 911 operator needs to explain that because of budget cuts in her county, there is no law enforcement in her area on the weekends. And listen to the conversation as it unfolds.
I don't have anybody to send out there. Okay. Obviously, if he comes inside the residence and assaults you, can you ask him to go away, or do you know if he's intoxicated or anything?
I've already asked him. I've already told him I was calling you. He's spoken before, busted down my door, assaulted me. So.
Is there any way you can safely leave the residence?
No, I can't. Because he's blocking pretty much my only way out.
Well, the only thing I can do is give you some advice and call the sheriff's office tomorrow. Obviously, if he comes in and unfortunately has a weapon or is trying to cause you physical harm, that's a different story. The sheriff's office doesn't work up there. I don't have anybody to send.
I don't have anyone to send. Of course, the horrible reality is that that man just, because there's no law enforcement in her area, proceeds to break into that home, assaults her, strangles her, and rapes her. This is what happens when there is, as the operator said, no law enforcement in your area. And the reason I begin here is because what I'm so eager for us to do is to step into the shoes for just a moment of the daily reality of 4 billion people in our world who the UN says live outside the protection of law. And in particular, the poorest in our world, who the UN says most poor people live outside the protection of law. And what does that mean? To not have anyone who will come for you in your moment of terror and need in the face of violence. That's a big statistic, 4 billion people living outside the protection of law. But what does that sort of look like more graphically? Well, it looks like this in Bolivia, where if you sexually assault a child, you're at greater risk of slipping in the shower and dying than you are of ever being sent to prison for that crime. That means that there's a law on the books that makes it illegal to sexually assault a child, but as the children know and as the predators know, it's not really against the law in any way that's meaningful to anybody. Right? Likewise, in India, statistically, it is now true that if you enslave someone, you're at greater risk of being struck by lightning than you are of being properly convicted and jailed for that crime. This is a picture of the utter brokenness and dysfunction of criminal justice systems in the developing world. And something that for us is quite hard, I think, to relate to, because you can just feel that outrage moment in that phone call, right? When what? There's no law enforcement? Tonight, I'd like to have us think a little bit about where that expectation comes from and what it means, what it would mean to live outside of that expectation. This total collapse of criminal justice systems in the developing world has unleashed this massive hidden epidemic of violence against the poor. And what we like to call actually everyday violence against the poor, because we will hear about violence against the poor, but usually in the headlines, it's the catastrophic events, right? It's the wars and the conflicts. It's the mass atrocities, the genocide. And I know something about these kinds of cataclysmic violent events because I was the director of the UN's genocide investigation in Rwanda and was given by UN military intelligence just a list of 100 different mass graves and massacre sites just a few weeks after the war, where there were just hundreds of thousands of people strewn out in the open who had been butchered by their neighbors. And the horrific job that I and the other members of the team had was very simply to sort through all that physical evidence and try to recreate the picture of what is it like? What was it like for those victims of genocide to have those machetes making their way towards them? And the thing that struck me so powerfully was the way that in that moment of terror, those people are not crying out for someone to give them some food, or to bring a doctor, or to bring a teacher, or to provide a microloan. They're crying out for someone to restrain the hand of the machete, right? And so clearly the way in which violence is a different problem. And the Rwandans who suffered in the genocide were very, very poor. The average Rwandan was living off about 65 cents a day. But in that moment, the greatest need for them was for someone to deal with the violence. But what I learned after the Rwandan genocide was a source of violence that ends up crushing far more people than ever are crushed by these cataclysmic headline-grabbing events. It is for the poor the everyday violence that crushes the lives of hundreds of millions. There are actually, in the book, we sort of lay out 4 categories of this violence that stays below the surface. Because that's the other aspect of this violence. It's not only every day, but it's somehow just below the surface of us actually seeing it. Because if we were to do an exercise to sort of close our eyes and just picture global poverty, what would come visually to your mind's eye? It'd probably be the things you see, right? It's the shacks, it's the kids with sort of dirty clothes and look vaguely sort of ill-fed, and then we think of sickness, and we think of dirty water and bad sanitation. But rarely would we automatically picture, when we think of poverty, of violence. And yet this is the fact that just as endemic to poverty as hunger or disease or homelessness is the reality of violence. And underneath the surface of poverty that we would see, in the developing world, there's this massive hidden epidemic of violence. And it takes up 4 primary categories as sort of the most pervasive. And the first is gender violence. This is simply sexual violence and domestic abuse of women and girls. It is open season on the poor. In fact, the World Health Organization has now documented that for women between the age of 15 and 44, gender violence accounts for more death and disability than malaria, cancer, car accidents, and war all combined. This is the everyday violence, right? But it's beneath the surface. And so actually the first thing we do in the book is we try to take you along on a particular journey that I went on with this mother from Peru named Lucilla. She's just a very common mother in an Andean town that you would never have any reason to have your attention drawn to. But what we discovered in her town was actually a rate of sexual assault against women and girls that was actually greater than that which was coming out of the worst war zones of the Congo. And yet you would never know it. And what this story does is it takes you into this hidden world, and you simply follow Lucilla as she tries to seek justice for her 8-year-old daughter who was horrifically raped and murdered and then just dumped out on the street. And the utter impossibility for her to ever have a chance of justice in her community for one reason: she has no money. And what is that like for actually hundreds of these mothers who represented themselves in there by this half dozen mothers who came and just shared their stories of what it is like to have your daughter horrifically assaulted, but you go to the authorities and you just don't have any money, and so you get no justice. So gender violence is the first massive and most pervasive category. The second category is slavery, straight up slavery. The Global Slavery Index tells us that there's about 30 million people held in slavery in our world today, which is, as many of you would perhaps know, more people in slavery today than at any other time in history. We really do celebrate, and we ought to, the great abolitionists of the 19th century, but it's a bit of an odd thing in a way, right, when there are more slaves now than during their period or patch of history. In fact, there are more people in slavery today than were extracted from Africa during 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. Thankfully, a smaller proportion of human beings than any time in history are slaves. That's true. A smaller proportion of the world economy is driven by slavery. That's true. That's good news. But there are just so many more people on the earth in this era that in absolute numbers, there are more people in slavery today than in any other time in history. But again, this will be hidden to our eyes. And that's why in the book, we actually go to Bangalore, to the high-tech capital of India, the city that really gave Thomas Friedman this epiphany that the world was really becoming flat because of their access to technology and the incredible vibrance of the Indian economy there. But an Indian lawyer could just take me about 20 minutes to the beltway that ran around Bangalore to a brick factory where scores of people have been held in slavery. And then I could sit with Mariama, this amazing woman, as she and about 24 other slaves, former slaves, described what it was like in the 21st century to work as a slave in the brick factory. To work 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, making and carrying bricks. And if anyone tried to run away from the brick factory, they'd be dragged back and just viciously beaten in front of the others. In fact, when 2 of the slaves were able to run away and escape because they needed to try to help their sick children who were in another village, the owner of the brick factory actually just took his men and abducted family members and friends from that village and held them as hostages and publicly declared to everybody, until you bring back my slaves, we're going to continue to torture them every day. Not even hiding it, right? Because he knows there will be a greater chance of him being struck by lightning than for ever going to jail for that crime. This is the massive epidemic of slavery in our world. The third massive category of violence against the poor, horrifically, is police abuse. The World Bank did this study of the poor all across the developing world, the largest study of its kind, and it said one of its most surprising conclusions was the way that police and justice systems in the developing world make poor people less secure and poorer. This is as if the world were to discover, oh, the hospitals in the developing world make everyone sicker. The schools in the developing world actually prevent anyone from learning how to read. What if we were to learn that actually the police and courts in the developing world actually make people less safe? In fact, for the common poor person, the police many times will be the one who will actually end up stealing more money from them than any other criminal in their community. This is sort of the upside down terror when you find out, as may be the case, right? The scariest movie you ever sort of see that grips you the most is when you find out that the good guys are actually the bad guys. And for the common poor, they run away from the police to be safe rather than to the police for safety. And what is the impact of that on the lives of the poor? The fourth category of massive violence against the poor is the violent theft of their land. You would know from sort of basics of development or just some common sense that for a poor person, their greatest capital asset that they could even possibly use to get out of poverty would be able to leverage this little piece of land that they have so they can have a little shelter and a little garden and maybe grow a little food to sustain themselves. But if you come and steal that land away, you haven't just sort of done a rotten thing. You've cast those people into utter destitution. And of course, there are about 5 million people every year around the world, the poorest of which have their land just swept away from them because they're weaker. And it turns out that this always preys upon the weakest, who turn out to be usually widows, and especially in Africa. Widows like Linda, who have their land stolen from them just because there are people who are stronger in the community and can do so. The devastating thing about this is to realize, though, that widows in the developing world support 500 million orphans. Steal their land, and you now have 500 million orphans who are likewise cast into destitution. The purpose of all of this sort of litany of these massive categories of violence is, first of all, to bring it to the surface, and then having done that, to then begin to think, oh my goodness, what is going to be the impact? What are the implications of this level of violence amongst billions of the world's poorest? And this is why we call the book The Locust Effect. It is that image that has been amongst humans for thousands of years, of the way the poor person sort of scrapes at the earth to try to get themselves out of poverty. And they start to see the earth beginning to produce a little bit of goodness, and their crops are almost ready to be harvested, and they can then perhaps provide a way out of poverty for their family. And then one day the locusts descend. And actually, in a matter of hours, just destroy it all. This is the way predatory violence works in the lives of the poor. It descends and just can destroy everything that they have been working on. But not only do the locusts have the power to destroy the fruit of the farm work, but that farm work doesn't stop the locusts. In other words, not only do the locusts destroy so much of what we and the poor person themselves do to try to get out of poverty, but if we don't do something different than the traditional approaches to poverty, we won't stop the violence, which is destroying the fruit. So this is the suggestion from the book, that we need to start talking about, thinking about, and responding to violence differently. What we're finding in the book is that the locust effect is destroying this dream of ending global poverty. There's certainly progress, and we can speak to that. But what we're running up against is pretty much the limit of what you might be able to get to if you don't address this violence. The other great dream of this century that it's destroying is this idea that every human being would have basic human rights secured to them. What happened over the last half century is that we had this marvelous struggle to enshrine these and articulate these wonderful international norms about the way everyone should be treated. And they're put in human rights declarations and treaties and protocols. And then another marvelous fight is undertaken to embed those standards in national law so that everyone has a claim to those basic rights. But when you've embedded, as we have over 50 years through great work and effort, those rights in national law, what you've basically done is handed over the enforcement of those precious, precious rights to local law enforcement, which, if it does not work, those poor have no access to those rights. So what the poor now have in the developing world after 50 years of hard work is very, very different laws. They're not suffering because they don't have laws. They're suffering because they don't have law enforcement, which it works sort of like a vaccine, which the brilliant people sort of are able to invent and put together. But what if it all was just stored in the warehouse, stacking up somewhere, and never actually got delivered to someone's bloodstream? That's where it actually makes a difference. And likewise for law enforcement, laws on the books don't make any difference for us or a poor person. What matters is whether or not it's actually enforced. But we would go into the developing world and we see things called police and we see things called courts, and we think, well, it's probably not working out as great as it should, but at least things are moving along. Those institutions, we are finding, don't do anything what we would expect them to do. And so the poor have been cast into this lawless chaos. Why are these justice systems so broken, and what are the implications? One of the primary implications is, as I mentioned, the way it undermines our efforts to address poverty. And just one example of that has made this so clear is the really incredible power that comes from getting education for young girls in the developing world. The girl effect, this amazing, powerful thing that happens if you can educate a girl in the developing world. We're coming to this truth, just as we're also coming to the truth that the primary reason girls are not going to school in the developing world is violence. Violence in the home, violence on the way to school, horribly violence in the school. An example, again, of these things that we would be seeking to do alongside the poor to strengthen them. But if we do not address the violence, that rug is just pulled right out from underneath them. So why are these justice systems so broken? The book brings out really 4 basic reasons, surprising reasons, I think, that we've discovered along the path. But I'll just mention one here. And maybe you'll read the book to discover the other surprises. But one of the primary reasons is simply this, that those with wealth and power in the developing world, and even those common people who might just have a decent business or any property, they know the criminal justice system doesn't protect them. They know the police cannot be relied upon, nor can the courts reliably protect them in disputes. And so they have withdrawn from the public system and set up a completely parallel private system of security and justice. If you've gone to the developing world, you've probably noticed, if you were looking around a little bit, that just about every place you went, there's somebody with a gun, and it's not a police officer. It's a guard at the hotel, it's a guard at the restaurant, it's a guard at the bank, it's a guard at almost everywhere you go. In fact, in places like Guatemala, the private security force is 7 times larger than the public police force. In Africa, the largest employer is private security. In one of the most unremarked upon but massive social transformations in the developing world, a completely parallel system of private justice has been set up for those who can pay for it. And you know what happens to a public institution when the people with money and influence leave that institution actually gets worse and worse. And that's one thing if it's the libraries, it's one thing if it's transportation, but what if it is basic law and order? What that does is cast the poor into a place where if you cannot afford to be safe, you're not. It becomes a little bit confusing because much of the developing world is producing some decent rates of economic growth. And you look at a place like India and many of the countries of Africa, and in the aggregate you think, oh, there's economic growth there. But if you disaggregate that growth, you find that that growth is coming from the sector that has enough money to pay for personal security. But the 2.5 billion who live off $2 a day or less are left in this lawless chaos. So this is one of the reasons those systems have gotten so bad, unspeakably bad, is because of the withdrawal of those who have wealth and property and commerce from those systems. Well, after the book, of course, engages, as I've done tonight, perhaps to completely depress you with all the massive violence and just horrible darkness in the developing world for the poor, the question is there any hope? And I do think the book takes this pivot towards hope and finds 2 places of hope with sort of special force. One is just looking at history. Here's the truth that we really have forgotten, is that every functioning criminal justice system that provides a reasonable amount of security in the world and actually operates reasonably well, at one point was brutal and corrupt and dysfunctional. They all start that way. And you can recover in the book the history of, oh my goodness, how did policing actually emerge as something that was actually useful? It's a fairly recent phenomenon. It was actually invented in the middle of the last 19th century. And certainly in every American city, and we look at other cities around the world, it starts out, you have all this violence, people come together to build a police force and a criminal justice system, and it becomes completely co-opted by a political faction or by moneyed interest. It's completely brutal and corrupt. And yet then there is engaged this fight to see that that system actually serves everyone. And it is why we all were able to come safely to this event even tonight. So we recover the history of that, but then also some demonstration projects around the world that show it's possible even now and in the developing world. One of them, of course, is the story of our project in the Philippines, which was sponsored by the Gates Foundation in the city of Cebu, which is the 2nd largest city in the Philippines, which had a horrific problem of sex trafficking of children, primarily because law enforcement was not protecting the children, it was protecting the sex traffickers. So the experiment was, can we get law enforcement to switch sides? And if they switch sides, does that make a difference? Or do we need to maybe get rid of all the poverty in Cebu before we can meaningfully address sex trafficking of children? Well, after 4 years of standing up law enforcement and getting them to actually switch sides and to actually go after the sex traffickers, though the goal of the project was a 20% reduction in the victimization of children in the commercial sex trade, as measured by outside auditors, the actual finding of the auditors was actually a 79% reduction in the victimization of kids in the commercial sex trade. Because you simply discover that the people who oppress the poor are not brave. And if you start to send them to jail, they just start to leave the poor alone. IJM and other institutions around the world are engaged in these projects of hope that I think will transform your sense of what is possible. 2 things that we're hoping you will do in response to the book. First, we'd like you to share the book. You can only share what you actually yourself get a hold of. So this is an encouragement to actually buy the book. All the royalties from the book just go to IJM and to the actual field work of protecting the poor, but also what we want you to be a part of. and I mean this most sincerely to all of you who are here in the nation's capital, to be part of changing the conversation about poverty, just so that we begin to mainstream this challenge of dealing with violence if we are going to engage the fight against poverty in the world. One of the ways we'd like to have you do that is not only get the book, share it with others, engage whatever forum you are in where people are thinking about the world, but secondly, actually begin to affect a really important conversation that's taking place in the UN right now in the rewriting of what they call the Millennium Development Goals. You might know in the year 2000, the international community came together to try to put together the blueprint to address poverty. And they came up with these 8 Millennium Development Goals. And it's been actually quite a powerful tool in many ways to move progress on these 8 priorities. But one of the really grave mistakes that took place in the formation was the complete absence of any mention at all of the problem of violence, which we now know just from the data and from what makes great common sense, that if you do not control the violent forces in the community, you can give all kinds of goods and services to the poor, but if you don't stop the bullies from taking it away, you're going to be disappointed in what it is that comes as the ultimate result. So as these are now being rewritten in this process, we are just encouraging everyone to go on to go to the locusteffect.com/petition and then sign on right there as a petition that goes to the Secretary General of the UN that begins to just make it very, very clear that we want to make sure that when we make a plan to address poverty over the next 15 years, that we're addressing the problem of violence. You know, the amazing things about the AIDS epidemic, which in our era is both a horrific, tragic, just disaster, but also a story of millions of very common citizens around the world coming together to say this is not acceptable. And it wasn't just the experts that came around and said, no, I'm going to stand up and fight this epidemic. It was millions of average citizens saying, this is unacceptable. I'm going to raise my voice and say, we've got to put our heads together, put our resources together, and stop this. Likewise, as the locusts descend upon the poor in the developing world and rip away their hope of a future for their children, we just need to get in front of this and say enough is enough, and this is one way to express that. Thank you again for coming. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a special pleasure to be with you here today, and I'm very thankful that the Trinity Forum and Pepperdine are hosting and asked me to play a small part in it as well. So I'm biased. I like Gary's work. I've had occasion in heading the State Department Office on Human Trafficking to even make the decision how to spend your tax dollars and thinking that his organization deserved some of them to do their work in India and elsewhere in the world. And I even used some of Gary's and Victor's work published in Foreign Affairs in the classroom now at Georgetown University. So I expected to like this book. It exceeded my expectations. I like the fact, most striking, about how it situates violence against women, forced labor, trauma, as a central set of issues in development. We have other images that come to mind with poverty, and I think particularly about violence against women, it's one of the best pieces of writing that explains how it fits into this larger picture of development, and not just a feeling book, but a rational set of answers. From the subtitle of this book, Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence, one would think that this is a book chiefly about poverty and violence. It is a book, as Gary just let you know, that's about rule of law. It is about rule of law. And that gap between law that exists on paper, promulgated in countries or in treaties ratified in the UN, and the actual practice. I think perhaps the more appropriate phrase than rule of law is access to justice. Entire categories of people, whether they be Dalits in India, women, children, migrants, are not treated as human beings in full before the law. And so a message of this book that's quite powerful is that there must be less impunity of those who would commit violence against those categories of people. There are, in fact, a great need for more indictments of those who would bring about that violence. But the biggest indictment of this book, if you probe, is the indictment of foreign aid. Foreign aid by the US government, foreign aid by other governments, foreign aid by multilateral institutions, which has not to date focused on this problem of rule of law. And so one of the biggest prescriptions that comes out of this book is to say that foreign aid needs to be completely turned upside down and focus on this issue of rule of law. And the book provides some pretty powerful statistics about the shortchanging of rule of law in foreign aid. It's an interesting message in this book that suggests there's an enormous imperative for local ownership in communities of enforcing the law. And yet there is a part to be played by the international community in what Gary and Victor call in the book international bridges to actually enhance law enforcement. They look at three categories of law becoming a reality and implementation: police, who need to have more capacity and less corruption; prosecutors and legal defenders, who need to be equipped to do the job and to prioritize stopping the impunity of predatory violence; and importantly, courts. They focus a good deal in this book on the pattern of justice delayed being justice denied. In many of the countries that I had opportunity to visit as the anti-human trafficking ambassador for the United States, such as India, Brazil, South Africa, part of the problem is a bad guy is identified, and yet the courts take so long to hold someone to account that there is no justice for the person violated. And by the way, I learned a lesson from a South African Supreme Court justice who said to me, problem is that to train judges to prioritize the right things and worry about violence against women and impunity, there's only one person the judge is willing to be trained by, another judge. So courts are an important part of the picture. I think one of the most striking images in this book is this being an inflection point in history, an important moment in history where there have been some successes, strikingly in China, for all of the political repression in China, people brought out of a situation of poverty, and yet there's so many who are being left behind, and not for the reasons that people have thought in the past, but because of lack of rule of law. And at that inflection point in history, Gary and his co-author Victor focus on how this was licked in the past. Licked in Europe, licked in New York with law enforcement, and licked in the Wild West, which was really kind of a nice image for us, that much of the developing world is really the Wild West, and we need to create a situation of accountable law. So I have a few comments of my own after seeing these as the most striking ideas. This is a beautifully illustrated book with lots of good examples, in particular the 15 pages that are on Cebu in the Philippines and the success of the IJM project documented by the Gates Foundation is striking. But I must say the elephant in the room of this book, of an example, is India. The great success story of development and a success story of democracy while you're at it. And yet so many people left behind, and not just the Dalits and people of disadvantaged castes. It's a huge success, ... but. And the but is because of this lack of rule of law. An interesting thing that emerges in the book, I would observe, is the importance of business and to business of this phenomenon. Gary and Victor stress that with reduced corruption and with increased productivity in international development, it would be enormously beneficial to business to help deal with this problem of rule of law. They need to be a partner at the table, and they have a lot to offer. Now, I think that we can't rely only on the UN. I think it's great that Gary has suggested that you should join petitions to make sure the Millennium Development Goals focus on the rule of law. I myself recently spoke at an open working group at the UN about this very issue, because Gary and I tend to think on the same wavelength. But we need others besides the UN and besides governments. I myself, influenced by Gary's and Victor's writing in Foreign Affairs, made the proposal that while we have a global fund to fight HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, we also need an analog to help create rule of law capacity in the world. I suggested it should be called a global trust for rule of law. We can't rely only on states and multilateral institutions and their old models of foreign assistance, which are broken, as the Locust effect drives home. There are a couple of takeaway big ideas in this book, just below the surface. One is indeed the word trust, and is for that reason that I use the expression global trust, like global fund, but global trust for rule of law. What would be created by rule of law is trust. People who are impoverished, who cannot count on the fruits of their labor being protected because the locust effect of predatory violence is going to rob them of it, they need trust. They need to be able to trust authorities, law enforcement, that they won't be the instruments of robbery and violence, but in fact, protectors. And there's a call in this book for a kind of virtuous cycle of social demand, communities demanding more of their authorities, more implementation. And that's one of the roles of the international community, is to empower the hope of people that they can demand more of law enforcement, a virtuous cycle of trust. So trust is a big issue here. But the other idea, and this will not surprise my wife who's here, that I take away from this book is dignity. Human dignity, people of equal value because they're all created in the image of the Lord, they have to be able to thrive based on the gifts that God has given them. And if they don't have the agency and they don't have the recognition that they're human beings in full, in a practical, implemented way, not just laws on paper and in treaties, but in reality, they will not thrive. And so at essence, this is a book about human dignity. I, of course, think that because that's something I'm writing about, but I think an appropriate thing for an audience with a faith-based cast. And so I leave with a dirty trick. I want to throw 3 questions that I hope Gary might think about as you introduce questions for a dialogue, but 3 questions that came to mind in reading this book this weekend, which was a joy. And I'd move from the most abstract question to the most particular. 3 questions. First question. So what is especially faith-based about this book, and especially faith-based about International Justice Mission, one of the most disciplined, serious NGOs that worries about metrics and applies former law enforcement to work on behalf of the global poor? What is especially faith-based? I submit to you that perhaps the dignity message is what might be part of that answer. Secondly, does political development necessarily come before economic development? Or do they come simultaneously? One of the great debates. A different thinker, a Bangladeshi woman who headed Amnesty International, Irene Khan, and she currently heads the International Development Law Organization. She, in her book, The Unheard Truth About Global Poverty, says political development and economic development have to come simultaneously. She uses the very same phrase that Gary and Victor use. Legal empowerment of the poor is necessary. She says simultaneously. I suspect Gary and Victor may be right, but I'd love to hear more about sequencing. Finally, the most particular question, and this is informed by a long dialogue with Gary's lieutenant, Holly Burkhalter. Holly Burkhalter, the Vice President for Government Relations, used to work in the 1980s on worrying about who the United States was empowering in its dirty allies in the Cold War, such as in Latin America. That kind of thinking informed the passage of the Leahy Law, which requires the United States to take care who it trains in the military and the police of other countries. So for Gary, I have the question, is the Leahy Law out of date? Do we need to think more about who we can train abroad? Or is there still a danger that if you in your international bridges are helping strengthen and professionalize law enforcement Is there a danger you'll make the wrong calls? And sometimes actually strengthen law enforcement at the expense of the global poor. How should we go about that as a public policy issue? So I look forward to our dialogue.
Thank you so much, Mark and Gary. We call this an evening conversation because we do want to have a dialogue and do want to hear from you. And so we're going to turn to audience Q&A, and certainly there is much to discuss. While people are thinking of their questions, Gary, I'll give you a chance to respond to at least one of the questions that Mark posed. And as you're thinking of questions, if you have a question, just raise your hand. I will call on you here. Elias and Margaret have microphones in the back. Wait until you get the microphone to speak. The only sort of guidance we give you in terms of questions is we do ask that they are all phrased in the form of a question and not as a speech denunciation or the like. We also ask that they be brief, and as the moderator, reserve the right to call the question if it goes on too long. So as you're thinking and about what to say, Gary, why don't you take a shot at the question of your choice posed by Mark?
I'm prepared to answer all three. Question number 3, yes. No,
He's succinct.
number 2, simultaneously. And as to the first, the book is faith-based in the sense the author, myself, and I believe Victor as well, have entered into this concern for problems of human suffering out of our own formation of our own heart and mind for engagement with those in need in the world. And as convinced Christians, we engage the world believing that God cares deeply about human suffering, and he invites us to be his hands and feet and courage in the world to address it. It ends up in a set of pursuits and activities which others end up pursuing, that is the seeking of justice, who do not share that faith the way you could be a heart surgeon as a person of faith, or a heart surgeon who does not follow that particular kind of faith. And so it is motivated by us and the International Justice Mission by our faith, but it's an invitation to everybody, and the book is directed to an audience that shares that faith, has no faith or a different faith, and is in pursuit of relief of those who are suffering, regardless of their faith as well. So.
Questions right here.
Regard this evening.
Oh, thank you, yes.
Sorry that he wasn't able to join us.
Thank you.
If I could, I'd like to follow up essentially on the question about the Leahy Law.
Yeah.
But I'd like to pose it slightly differently, which is, given the increasingly secular bent, certainly of our federal government, is it perhaps that we're incapable structurally of providing the right training as opposed to just providing training? Are we capable, as at the federal level, of actually providing the kind of training that you might have in mind for some of these kinds of organizations?
Yeah, I personally think we're highly capable of doing that. It would just simply be overwhelmingly a matter of political will. We've been capable of actually incredibly effective training in the developing world of law enforcement when it was addressing priorities that mattered to us back home. That is counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism, counter-smuggling. So we've actually done a tremendous amount as a government assisting law enforcement in the developing world when it dealt with a priority that was that mattered to us. And in the process, we've done things well and done things badly, but we've learned a lot about how you actually do that effectively. One of the lessons that we've experienced is you need to work cases with law enforcement over a long period of time. But we demonstrate that we're capable of doing that. But it will take, as Ambassador Lagon indicated, a reorientation of our point of view of what it means to partner with other countries in the process of development. Yeah.
Anything to add, Mark?
No, not going
All
to
right.
improve on that.
All right. Right here, if you just wait for the microphone.
I was just wondering, have you seen a similar trend in U.S. law enforcement about addressing systemic violence in poverty? Because I know it's easy to address things like you mentioned, counter narcotics, counter smuggling, larger, big crimes that might be easier to convict criminals in, as opposed to the violence that happens daily, like domestic violence, violence amongst neighbors, things like that.
Well, crime, it's important to look at fighting crime along an axis of risk. As I say, different kinds of crime has an elasticity, a responsiveness to risk that's really quite different. That is to say, what happens in a society is when they develop a crime-fighting capacity, they're able to relatively quickly address a massive amount of soft crime, what we call crime of opportunity. People are committing those crimes because there's no risk. But when there is risk, they stop doing it. That's why we call it crime of opportunity. So what you can see in developed countries is when they were in early stages of chaos, people of violence and will and ingenuity committed massive amounts of violence because there's a free-for-all. And what happens is the community says, okay, this is not working. Let's put together a law enforcement capacity which empowers some people with coercive force. Then what happens is that coercive force is captured by the moneyed interest or the political interest. And so then it's not a whole lot better than what was started with. The people of power are just abusing a new coercive instrument. But then a fight is engaged and the community grabs a hold of that for the purposes of protecting the whole community. And you see a tremendous accelerated capacity to reduce crime of opportunity. But crime of social pathology, crime of necessity, crime of desperation, those all become tougher. And in the United States, there certainly is most of the crime that we are going after is what we call hard crime. It's really quite difficult to get after. But you will find the crime of opportunity frequently in the poorest communities where law enforcement may be weakest. And so even in our own country, you will have a disproportionate victimization of the poor because they will have weaker law enforcement capacities. But there's this tremendous arc of different kinds of crime and how effectively and how quickly they can be addressed. In the developing world, the vast, vast majority of these billions of people who suffer under these four categories of crime, they're suffering under crime of opportunity. And because of, as the ambassador was saying, this aspect of impunity in their communities.
I'd like to say a word about this. When I headed the State Department Human Trafficking Office, the office puts out a global report that gives grades to every other country on how they're doing fighting human trafficking. And it's kind of high-octane finger-wagging from the United States, and I'm very much in support of the idea, but the credibility of the United States is tied to talking about what's going on at home in terms of justice. And not just crowing about all that we're doing to put the bad guys in human trafficking behind bars. And one of the most striking things about the poor and those who are mistreated by the legal system are minors in prostitution, U.S. citizen minors in prostitution, who are much more likely to be treated as a criminal and detained than treated as a victim of violence and crime as they are, of rape as they are. And even those law enforcement who see children in prostitution in the United States as victims sometimes have to resort to them being detained because there are, in this very rich country of ours, not enough beds for those child victims of sex trafficking. And so this is something born of poverty and born of not prioritizing something important. I think one of the greatest injustices in the world is when the victim of violence is treated as if they are a criminal or at fault themselves. The prostituted female, the migrant worker who's actually a human trafficking victim, if they are blamed rather than assisted, that is doubly violating them.
Other questions? Right over here, Elias, and then we'll go to the front row. The microphone's coming.
We're talking about poverty and violence violence of opportunity, right? So in many poor countries, this is a kind of a common theme, which maybe you've experienced. You're pulled over, you're driving on a road innocently, you're pulled over. This happened to me 3 times recently. So you could drive all the way back to this place and you could go to court and we could talk about your car that's like totally wrong. Or you could just pay me right now and you can pay me 100, whatever, and it'll be finished. That's law enforcement, and in a way I guess you can call that a crime of opportunity. It's an opportunistic moment. My impression in watching that happen was that the law enforcement officers themselves were about that much higher on the economic rung, and the power, maybe hugely higher on the power rung, but that much higher on the economic rung. So we have people who are extremely poor and needy who are now in a position to get money however they can. And so I didn't read your book yet, I'm sorry, and maybe you address it in the book. But to me, that's a big dilemma. How does that get addressed?
For sure. A couple of things quickly to say, because we do go into the developing world and think, wow, there's so much poverty, they probably couldn't afford to have a decent police force that's decently paid and trained. But then when you put together the numbers on what's being paid on private security, you realize, oh, the economy has plenty of money to do this. The interesting example that's given in the book is of the country of Georgia, which fascinatingly in 2003 was ranked about 145 or so out of 190 countries as most corrupt in the world, especially their police. More corrupt than any country that we currently work in or there's written about in the book. But in a 7-year, very committed effort of anti-corruption reforms, they were able to transform the police so that they are now ranked by Transparency International as being less corrupt than the US, the French, or the German police. Now, how did this happen? One of the really, really critical things is they fired 16,000 police officers in a single day. And the capital city got safer. What was happening is that they would pay a police officer $10 a month. That police officer would have to pay a $10,000 bribe to get the job. What kind of job would you pay $10,000 for if you're only paid $10 a month? Well, because obviously you're just being handed a badge and a weapon as a means of extorting money, right? So they had to turn that thing completely upside down. And one of the things is they then had to shrink the force, pay it so much better, train it well, give it good equipment, and they have a police force that has greater integrity than the average American, German, or French police in a 7-year period of time. So that case study has been written up by the World Bank. It's in the book. It's just an insight into the way in which, as the Georgian Prime Minister said on occasion, that corruption is not a culture, it's a choice. But what you have to do, I believe, and what the book argues for, is you got to deal with the police first. Many times there's attempts to kind of go after corruption in the society in a whole lot of other places, but corruption is a crime. The police are your crime-fighting capacity. And if your police are criminal by these acts of corruption, then your very crime-fighting force by which you will be able to get after it in other sectors is useless. And so it's possible, and it's the right place to start.
Mark, you look like you have thoughts. No thoughts right now. All right. Josh.
Question for Gary, based on what Mark raised about foreign aid.
Yeah.
And I wonder just what IJM field officers think about foreign aid, which I understand from the Gates letter is about 6 or 7/10% of the budget, the annual letter this year.
Yeah.
Are there ways to make that more effective? Should it be protected? Should it be a little bit bigger? What do you think of this trust fund idea,
Yeah.
Millennium Challenge accounts, foreign aid?
Well, it's fantastic. I mean, it's always funny. You've probably heard this, right? You ask Americans how much of the federal budget goes to foreign aid, and they guess about 25%. And then you ask them, well, how much should it be? Because that's probably too much. And they say, well, probably 10% probably should go. It sounds reasonable. And people just don't know that less than 1% or so actually goes to foreign assistance. And I think foreign assistance can be very, very effective. It can also be completely useless. It's like anything, it's how you do it. I do believe that there is need actually in this era right now for tremendous experimentation on how you can effectively use foreign assistance to increase the political will of your partner country to do this, and also help them with capacity building. The book doesn't say, here's the cookie cutter of how you could do this on a scale of trillions of dollars around the world so that we all have great justice systems in the developing world next Thursday. Actually, what it says is we're actually not sure how to do quite a complicated thing. But likewise, the AIDS epidemic was a horribly complicated, confusing thing a couple decades ago. But a lot of work and experimentation was pursued to figure out, well, what are the best practices and the best hopes for doing this? And then let's, in a thoughtful, determined way, gradually increase our investment so it's commensurate with the magnitude and the desperation of the problem.
You mentioned the Millennium Challenge Corporation. It has a great formula as an innovation during the Bush era that the Obama administration has embraced. In essence, it creates compacts with other countries, a way to understand the Millennium Challenge Corporation. It's sort of like the merit scholarships for the developing world on top of the need scholarships. If they're making movement, investing in people, governing justly, and making economic reforms. I think we need to go farther with something like the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS that focuses on this issue of access to justice, the one cone of the Millennium Challenge Corporation's work of governing justly.
Other questions in the back there?
I work in the relief and development sector, and so I take no umbrage to your question or your critique of the foreign assistance. I see the need for reform in addressing violence. However, the preponderance, particularly in relief work, doesn't go to countries like India and Thailand and Latin America. So my question to you is, what advice or how does this dialogue affect situations like South Sudan and Syria, where there is a need to address violence, but humanitarians aren't going to just sit back while they can't critique the violence going on? How does that play out when there's so many volatile pieces in motion?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there is just a very fair critique of international aid to begin with on where it is spent, on what countries and so forth. And many times it is driven more by political calculations or particular foreign policy priorities that aren't particularly targeted at trying to relieve the greatest amount of poverty in the world. Having said that, I will also say that the book does not suggest a powerful solution for how to bring this about in conflict states or in failed states. In fact, one of the things the book does say is that sadly, most of our most recent and most expensive experiments in trying to establish justice systems have been carried out in the places where the likelihood of it succeeding is as small as you could almost imagine. And what we're ending up doing is, while those are worthy pursuits, I think, because everybody understands after you dump all this blood and treasure in a conflict, that there's going to be nothing to show for it if there's just no nation that can actually function afterwards. So somehow everyone got really smart to figure out, well, we need to build justice systems right away in those places. Meanwhile, in a whole bunch of countries next door or around the world, there's no conflict, there's relative stability, but you still have a dysfunctional criminal justice system to which we've poured almost no assets at all, or resources or capacity to try to see what change is possible in the most promising places. So what the book really does argue for is that the vast majority of the poor these billion who live outside the protection of law are actually in reasonable, stable countries where actually you could do some things that would be quite transformative and hopeful, and it would not be the same challenge as trying to rebuild a country after a devastating war. And while both are very, very worthy, obviously, to do, it is a sad thing if we neglect the places where this is relatively doable because of the heartbreak of doing it in places where it was likely to be most impossible or most difficult.
It strikes me that there are three kinds of categories of countries in the developing world that the U.S. and the international community can think about for assistance. The kind of situations that you refer to, the humanitarian calamities, they're the war zones, the conflict zones, or post-conflict zones. And in the analogy of the emergency room triage, it's natural that we would focus on them, and I'm very focused on them. The second category is deeply impoverished countries, those who are being left behind, referred to as the bottom billion by some. But I do think that one of the cues from this book is to think about those who are the poorest or left behind in the most successful growing countries. Brazil, India, China. And how people are being left behind in those countries is through lack of access to justice. They aren't able to claim the fruits of their own gifts from God because they suffer from corruption, sexual violence, not being able to keep what they earn.
And increasingly, the world's poor is in middle-income countries, not in the low-income countries, right? So this is where the struggle is going to move to.
We're going to take one more question. And Elias, we're going to take it right here in the middle, third row, Mary Amendolia.
My question's for you both, Ambassador and for Gary. It's a personal question. How do you both maintain a sense of hope in what oftentimes, because you guys hear the most horrific of things day in, day out. So on your worst day, when you're feeling really down, really discouraged, what keeps you guys going? I mean, besides faith, but what specifically, where's your hope on the worst of days, despite the odds?
I'd be happy to go first, so you can have the last word. My wife, who's here, I've referred to before, was concerned when I became the anti-human trafficking ambassador that I would need to see a psychiatrist pretty soon because I would be depressed by the horror of what I heard. And of course, the truth is that you meet those people who have been victims of human trafficking who came through and who are survivors. But in particular, the inspiring people are those who fight in civil society organizations around the world, despite the corrupt officials, despite authorities who are utterly apathetic about predatory violence. It is those who, despite lack of resources and political authorities who don't want to do it, who in civil society demand change. The source of that social demand that Gary and Victor talk about in the book, they're inspiring. And so you come away from the experience of seeing millions upon millions of people who are victimized, and yet there are some who are standing up for them despite the odds. We just need to come and help them.
I think certainly personally for me, it's a demonstration of the way in which this work is meant to be done in community. That if you were doing it by yourself, I would be crushed in a moment by it. So it is meant to be done in community. And for someone like me to be able to do that in a Christian community as a convinced Christian, that affirms me in this hope and faith that I personally have. So people are going to find that support in different ways, that community, but for me, that is absolutely core. You all showing up by the hundreds here tonight is an example of, on the lowest day, you have people who care and they show up. And that has been my experience over and over again, personally. As Mark says, the real courage of the people who do the work of IJM in the field every day is inspiring and encouraging to me. I would also say that the hope of history, if you just look at what happens over the long arc of history, in my lifetime, the two perhaps most crushing human phenomena in a way of injustice, just so horrifically, first of all was the apartheid system that I experienced when I graduated from college and lived in South Africa. the most horrific, horrible, brutal thing you can imagine, has disappeared from the globe in my lifetime. The system of horrifically repressive communism as a system of abuse of human beings. In so many places, the wall came down and people are living in a level of freedom that you could never even imagine in the past. And there are other examples of this, which I think we are meant to grab a hold of. People say this a lot now, but it's marvelously true that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I believe this, and if we have a community to help us carry us over that long arc and some help bending that arc a little bit, we can make it to the other side.
And on that note of hope, thank you,
Great,
Gary
thank
and
you.
Mark. We at the Trinity Forum are excited about Gary and Victor's book. We commend it to you. It will be available for sale here. Gary and Victor will be over in that corner signing that book where you can also purchase it, and we just commend that to you. You'll also find for each of you on your chair there is an invitation to join the Trinity Forum Society. We also encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity for you. There are many benefits to doing so in addition to our daily what we're reading curated feed of the best articles out there, our quarterly readings which link classic literature and letters to timeless and timely issues. Our next one actually coming up is an abridged version and excerpts from Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom on the same topic, as well as invitations to events like this to help support and make possible these kinds of discussions. As a special incentive to join the Trinity Forum Society tonight only, if you join, we will give you a free copy of Gary's book. What better inducement could there be? So anyway, to hope you will join us and be part of both a community of people and part of other efforts like the ones we've had tonight. Finally, it seems appropriate to end with thanks. There's certainly much to be thankful for and many people to be thankful for. We so appreciate our partners at Pepperdine, Pete Peterson and the Davenport Institute, who've been a joy to work with on this lecture series. Several of you who have helped out in many ways. My own fantastic and talented staff, Rebecca Good, Margaret Eberly, Chloe Cuffle, our interns Elias Brockman and Victoria Chin. I am so thankful for your efforts. I'd also like to thank Capri Bell, who volunteered to help us out this evening. We appreciate you. And finally, thank you to Gary and to Mark for your very thoughtful comments, and to each of you for coming. We've been delighted to host you here. Good night.